Today we are joined by Jason Emerson. Jason is an award winning Lincoln Scholar and the author of 8 books and nearly 50 articles focusing on the lives of Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and his son, Robert Lincoln, both of whom have been misunderstood and misrepresented by history. He is the man who found the infamous lost Mary Lincoln insanity letters that historians have been searching for nearly 100 years. Enjoy the episode. So, you've said that you've been researching Lincoln and the Lincoln family for almost 30 years now, which is a very long time, probably judging by, how you look, probably the majority of your life. You don't seem like that old of a guy. So what, going back to the beginning, what inspired you to research the Lincoln family, and especially, because your specialty is Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, and Robert Lincoln, his son. So this is a more lesser known aspect of history that you sort of devoted yourself to. So just take me back to the beginning of this entire journey, and what was really the spark that ignited you to begin.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was 19 when I started. I was in college at the time, didn't want to be there. And a friend of mine saw on the walls of the college a thing called the Student Conservation Association, which still exists today. Um, and basically, what you did was you had to apply, get in to the SCA. You had to have references and applications and all this stuff. And then if you got in, then they give you a list of all 400 national parks, and you had to choose the four that you wanted to apply to. And it was just like a job; like there was no guarantee you'd get in. So I picked, of course, Alaska, Hawaii, Natural Bridges Monument in Utah, and I needed a fourth one. And so I'm looking through this list, and I've always loved history, so I thought, well, Lincoln's kind of cool. So I applied to the Abraham Lincoln home in Springfield, Illinois, and of course they were the only one that wanted me. And actually, I was, I think, fourth on their list, but the other three all wanted to go to Yellowstone, so I got to go there, and I just I loved it. So I was a student volunteer, but I did all the same jobs that a ranger does. I just had a different title, basically. And I loved every minute of it. And I was fascinated by Lincoln as well. So after that, I re-upped and I worked at Gettysburg. Then after that, I actually got into the National Park Service as a ranger, and I went back to Lincoln's home as a winter seasonal. I also worked at the Arch in St. Louis. But really, my second time at Lincoln's home is where I got into all this. So in college, I was a writing and literature major, and I've always been a writer. I love writing, but I've always loved history. And so, one day, for some reason I don't remember, I thought, I like to think I'm a pretty good writer. And I really love history. Maybe I should write about history. So when I worked at Lincoln's home, I was a winter seasonal, and so I'd give tours of the house mostly, and in winter we'd have maybe one a day. So basically, for 7 out of those 8 hours a day, I would be sitting in Mr. Lincoln's home by myself, reading books all about his life. Or after I'd been there for a few months, I would go into the office there for the Rangers and do some research until I got called over to give a tour. And so it was while I was there that I wrote my first couple of articles about Abraham Lincoln. And then, once I started, I never stopped. But very quickly I learned that I prefer, as you mentioned, I prefer to write about things that are not written about ad nauseum. So, you know, I write about Abraham Lincoln, but I do articles. I've done one book. It was about his invention and patent, which had never had a book done about it. And so when I discovered Robert Lincoln and Mary Lincoln and how little has been written about them, and on Mary Lincoln, how so much of what's been written about her is wrong for a couple of different reasons. That's why I focused on them rather than Abraham. But also by learning about his family, you can't understand a person if you don't understand their family. So that also helps us understand Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, his family's probably a massive impact on his life, on the way he governed. But going back, I mean, to your days as a park ranger giving these tours, that sounds like such kind of a surreal and incredible experience to be alone in is this Lincoln's boyhood home where he was born?
No, this is the house he lived in as an adult in Springfield, Illinois.
So you're in his house alone reading these books about his life, immersing himself and who he was as a person. What's sort of the metaphysical feeling that you have in those moments? I mean, can you cuz I've been to I've been to a couple houses of, famous figures. I went to the Arlington house. Um where Robert E. Lee lived, and that was obviously really cool because you're walking through and it's like, wow, Robert E. Lee lived here. But while we were walking through, the guy I was with, he pointed out, he's like, that's the desk that Robert E. Lee was sitting at when he refused Abraham Lincoln's letter to join the Union Army, which is a pretty incredible little piece of history right there. And then I've also been to Ronald Reagan's house in Santa Barbara, California, the Reagan Ranch, which is truly an incredible experience. It's a little bit different
That
from
is, yeah, I've been there.
you've been. Oh my god, it's amazing. It's different than other historical sites because when the Reagan sold it to YAF, because I'm a member of YAF, Young America's Foundation, so we went out there as part of a sort of a retreat. But when they sold it to YAF, they didn't touch a single thing. So there's no ropes in the house. His books are still laying on tables. His soap bottles are still literally in the shower from when he was using them. Their clothes are in the closet. So you're walking through his house and it's all the original furniture. Everything's completely original, untouched. So it feels like he's just out at the grocery store, walking around, could come back any minute. I'm standing in the guy's bedroom and it's like President Reagan was literally like sleeping here and nothing's changed. It's so surreal. But what was sort of that feeling that you have in the Lincoln home? Can you kind of feel his presence in a way?
Definitely, yeah. It was amazing. I mean, so, not everything in the Lincoln home is authentic to the Lincoln family, but much of it is. The big thing, though, the one that we tell everyone is that the handrail that goes up the stairs, that's original, and that people are always interested in that one. Like, wow, this was Abraham Lincoln touched this handrail that I'm touching as I'm going upstairs. So yeah, there was so much about it that I loved. Yeah, being in there alone is definitely this is going to sound a little cheeseball, but it's kind of a spiritual experience. It really is.
No, I 100% believe you.
Yeah, and it was, as I'm reading about his life, and like, well, the front room is where they offered him the presidential nomination to run for president for the Republican Party in this particular room. And in another room is the mirror, where I don't know if you know the story. Supposedly, right before he left for Washington, Lincoln was laying on a couch and he looked at this mirror and he said he saw two images of himself. One was normal and one was very white, ghostly, like he looked like he was dead. And as the story goes, he told his wife Mary, and she said, well, that means you're going to be elected twice, but you won't live to see the end of your second term. So that's an interesting story. That's kind of apocryphal. I believe that he saw the image. I don't believe that he told his wife. Mary never would have handled that kind of news. She emotionally she couldn't have handled that. But that mirror is in that room, and so I've looked in that mirror. It's kind of an amazing thing to think about.
And
There's
that's
just so
the original
much.
mirror.
It is, yeah. I believe it is, yeah. But at Lincoln's home is different though because when I gave a tour and the Rangers, we'd have to research and create our own tours. It's not a script; you have to do your own. And so my theme of my tour was, today Abraham Lincoln is a secular godhead. When he lived in that house, he was just a man. He was a middle class guy with a wife and children. He had a cow in the barn he had to milk every day. He had a horse he had to take care of. And he just lived his life there. And so, I would like to think about him being in the front room with his children, sitting there with the fire at night. He's reading a book. The children are playing. Mary's sewing. And you begin to see Lincoln as a man because he was just a man. I mean, we always hear about his greatness, but he had flaws. When he was president, he made mistakes, which he learned from as a good person does. But so yeah, it was incredible. When I went to the Mary Todd Lincoln home in Lexington, Kentucky, I had a moment like you were talking about. I was working on my book, my biography of Robert Lincoln, and I was just at the part where Robert was just 4 years old, and he and his parents went to Lexington, and they stayed in the Todd family home. And so there's, when you go up the stairs, it goes up and over and then up, and there's a seat by the window. And I think there were some books there. It's been like 20 years since I went there. But in many of the recollections, Lincoln spent most of his time in the library reading books, and he would sit on that windowsill and read them. And I remember that struck me. I'm like, wow, this is right in front of me. This is where he sat and would read books. And it's amazing what strikes you as you're in historic places or doing research in museums or archives.
It truly is incredible, and obviously we're both history buffs, so we can really deeply appreciate this sort of stuff. But I've said it before on this podcast. I really urge people to go to these sort of historical sites of any sort of figure or event that you're interested in, because when you're there, like you said, Lincoln was just a man. It strips away the legend and the larger than life figure that's been created throughout history and the mythology of him, and it strips it all away. And it's like, this was just a man. And just if you just rewind time a couple days ago, he was walking around here doing everyday normal tasks, reading books, milking the cow. And it's so incredible just to be there and to visualize that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's why, as you know, history is just endlessly amazing. One thing about, for me, and I'm sure many people are the same, is that having worked as a park ranger and stuff, I love the smell of a historic home. There is a smell that smells like history, and I miss that. And then whenever I go into a place like that and I smell that, I just get this wonderful wistfulness of, when I worked at Lincoln's Home or Gettysburg, or, I spent about 2 years at Hildene, Robert Todd Lincoln's home in Manchester, Vermont, which is a wonderful place. I highly recommend. It's just an incredible feeling that you can read a lot of books, but you don't get the same feeling when you're there.
Exactly. Yeah, I wanna linger on Abraham Lincoln a little bit before we get into Mary and Robert. Going back to this mirror image that he saw, I think it says a lot about, you know, who he was as a person, sort of the stuff he suffered with. I think it's pretty well known at this point that he did suffer from severe depression. So I think maybe that was the two versions he saw of himself. Um, but behind closed doors, who was Abraham Lincoln as a man in his personal life?
Yeah, he was, well, first of all, I do not subscribe to the belief that he was severely or clinically depressed. I think he definitely had periods of melancholy, as we all can do. Maybe he did more so than some people, but um, there are various reasons that I don't buy that. The main one, though, is that everyone can and does claim Lincoln for their own, and everybody can see things in him that reflects themselves. But also historians and regular readers and enthusiasts also, they tend to pack him with trials and tribulations that he may not necessarily have suffered, just to make him seem greater. Well, he fought a war and he did this and he did that. Oh, all while suffering from depression, all while dealing with his horrible harpy wife, which is an interpretation I don't agree with. All while suffering from, Marfan's or cancer, whatever people say. And a lot of people who knew him did that as well after he died. But so Lincoln, back to your original question, he was just a pretty normal guy. I think today, I mean, we've built him so much up in our heads today, but I think today people would probably be disappointed if they met him. Because, again, you can't always tell with photographs, but he was tall and lanky. He never combed his hair. His clothing didn't usually fit correctly. A lot of people, when he was alive, during his life, but especially after becoming president, they just thought he was incredibly uncouth because he would just tell jokes constantly, tell stories and anecdotes constantly. And to him, that was a way to deal with his stress, especially as president. But a lot of people back then thought it was very improper to do those things. And Lincoln was a man's man. He loved hanging out with the guys. He'd riding the Eighth Judicial Circuit. He'd be gone 6 to 9 months of the year, while every lawyer on the circuit would go home whenever they had a break. Lincoln didn't. He stayed out there the whole time. A lot of people think, well, it's because he hated his wife and he didn't want to go home. I disagree. I think he did that because he loved being out there. But also, when you read about Lincoln as a politician, he was brilliant. He could cite off facts and figures that nobody else knew without looking them up. He could tell you, who voted for whom and what precinct, how many votes this person got, what the percentage of voting was, how many people didn't vote. It's incredible. And he learned all these things. He became a great politician by talking to people. And that's what he would do on the circuit. He would just talk all night long to people, not just politicians and lawyers, but to everybody. He was a very democratic guy. And so, he seemed like he'd be a lot of fun to just someone to just hang out and talk with. But he was a politician. I'm sure that that's probably, it seems to me, I bet, we all talk about our passions. I bet he talked about politics constantly.
So you're an independent historian, and it seems that you kind of cut against the grain in terms of the mainstream narrative regarding the Lincoln family. Do you ever get a lot of flack from the historical community for your work?
So, sometimes there are some things I disagree with, and there are some things I don't disagree with. Sometimes there are some interesting things that we as historians disagree with. Most of my colleagues, we understand it's a difference of interpretation. Generally, people don't take it personally, but a lot of things that I have strong opinions on are because I've been studying them for so long, like Robert Lincoln or Mary Lincoln, that most others haven't because they focus on Abraham and they think they understand Mary or Robert from all the peripheral reading that they get. And which is nothing against them. I mean, they're not researching Robert, so why do they care? But, like Robert's reputation today is that he was a horrible person. He hated his mother. He was embarrassed by his father. He could care less about his family. And he was exactly the opposite of that. And, the big thing I deal with is my interpretation of Mary Lincoln. So, my first book was called The Madness of Mary Lincoln. And I write all about her mental health from childhood to death. And I consulted medical experts, and I think she suffered from bipolar disorder. And I found, 14 members of the Todd family who all had some form of mental disease. So it was a family trait. But I also think that she was an incredible woman in many ways, but she had very real flaws. And so I think you can't understand someone unless you understand and accept everything about them. So, especially with Mary today, people are either like, she was crazy and a horrible person that hated her husband, or, Lincoln was a moron and Mary was really the brains behind the throne. Really, she was Hillary Clinton 100 years too soon, which is utter baloney. But there isn't a lot in the middle, and I come down in the middle. So, it's all, we all of our Lincoln historians, we all have our things we focus on. So, the more we know about something, the stronger our opinions are. So, it's all, one thing I love is that, I don't take things personally. It's arguing and discussing these things is really what's exciting about it because there's so much out there that we don't know. I mean, nobody can know everything about Lincoln. So by discussing, you can maybe learn something you didn't know and maybe change your mind, maybe not.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm a huge believer in discussion. It's sort of the reason I started this podcast, something I'm super grateful for that this podcast has given me. It's given me the opportunity to speak with some brilliant historians like yourself. And really, you can read books and you can listen to videos, but nothing is the same as actual discussion and bouncing ideas off other people and really fleshing out kind of your own ideas and articulating them. And I think that's the most important um goal in terms of an academic journey, an intellectual journey is discussing because that's where the most breakthroughs occurs during discussion. But I want to pull on this thread of Lincoln just a little bit longer. You mentioned earlier that people have sort of used Lincoln for their own and their own ideologies. And he's obviously been so mythologized throughout American history. Do you think there's any dangers in creating a myth around characters that sort of bends history and misinterprets history in a way?
Oh, absolutely. I understand revisionist history and where it comes from, But where it has come to today, I, in many cases, not in all cases, in many cases, I abhor it. There are, as a historian, when history is all about rich old white guys, yeah, you're not getting the whole story. So, yes, we need books and articles and things about the women and the slaves and the lower class, middle class people, the regular people. We need all that. But when you start doing things like I just mentioned about Mary Lincoln, when feminist revisionism in the 1980s came around, and that's when it started. So Mary Lincoln, she was always Mary Lincoln. Today we call her Mary Todd Lincoln. That was because of feminist revisionist history in the 1980s. They inserted her maiden name, and it has still stuck. But she never went by that. But, people today, a lot of people think she was the brains behind the throne, the power behind the throne. Without her, Lincoln never would have been president. And I completely disagree with that. That's just not, you can't look at the 19th century from a 21st century viewpoint. So, there's that whole thing about Lincoln being gay that's going on right now
Really?
is the most ridiculous thing I've
What's
ever
that
heard.
argument about?
Um,
I haven't heard that.
oh, that's, there was a book 10 or 15 years ago, and actually there's a TV program that just came out, I think, a few months ago. And the whole argument of that basically is taking 19th century facts and figure social mores of what Lincoln did and who he was with and whatnot, and giving it a 21st century spin and calling it gay. So, basic example, when he was on the judicial circuit, he slept with men. Oh my God, that sounds horrible. Oh my God, he must have been gay. So, back on the judicial circuit, there'd be 12 lawyers. There'd be 2 rooms at the end, 1 bed in each room. So, sometimes if the bed was big enough, they'd sleep 4 to a bed. They go head, toe, head, toe, head, toe. That was the only place to sleep. There's no central heat. That's how you stay warm. I mean, that's that people, back in the day, even in the 1890s, not even in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, men would frequently tell each other in letters they loved each other. They would walk down the street arm in arm. Very manly, typical thing to do. Today, to us, that sounds gay. Back then, that's just what it was. So it's basically this whole argument is just taking it out of context, out of time, and just being ignorant about the facts. But it's interesting when you look at Lincoln as the mythologized person. Um, there definitely can be dangers to that, especially if you try to use him as a precedent for today. Um, I love politics, so I always find it interesting how every politician claims the Lincoln mantle from both parties, and they all say, "Well, Lincoln, if he were alive today, he'd be a Democrat." Like, oh well, if Lincoln were alive today, he'd still be a Republican because he was one. And so, it. I just find it interesting how people always try to claim his mantle. There's so many books about him that are wonderful and hilarious. My favorite has got to be that I ever found because there are books about Lincoln, Lincoln the poet, Lincoln the writer, Lincoln the horse rider, Lincoln the lawyer, Lincoln the whatever. My favorite one. There's one. This is a real book. It is called Lincoln's Doctor's Dog, and it's all about how Lincoln loved animals. Like, who wrote that and who published that? Well, I guess it had an audience of animal lovers. I don't know.
Yeah. What do you think, though? What do you think Lincoln would have thought of today's political landscape?
Oh, so many things.
It is a difficult, loaded
Yeah,
question, and a lot of historians I talk to, they don't like dealing in hypotheticals, but I do like delving into the realm of the unknown.
I do too. I think it's fun. It's all speculation. So, you can't get. I find people. It's humorous to me to get upset about it. You can't get upset about it. We're just speculating. I think. Well, first of all, I think Lincoln or so many politicians up until boy, I don't even know, early 20th century, they would be disgusted, dismayed, and shocked by how little character and statesmanship there is in the United States government today in both parties. Um, as far as Lincoln, there's arguments you could argue that he would be more of a Democrat today because he believed in national policy, often more so. See, he believed that the government should only do what individuals cannot do for themselves. which is pretty typical. That's a Republican philosophical point today, generally. But it depends on how you interpret, what can citizens not do? So Lincoln was in favor of national roads and national transportation as a Whig back in the day. The Democrats opposed it because they said, government doesn't need to get involved in that. That's a local issue. And so again, that's an interpretation. Well, yeah, roads are pretty national
Yeah, he probably would
today.
have loved Eisenhower, who created the
I think
interstate
so. Yeah.
system.
Oh, he would have loved the highway system because he tried to get that past Illinois, a highway system in Illinois when he was in the state legislature, and he never was able to make it work. But yeah, so I think, it's hard to say. I'm sure there's a lot of things about today he would love, things he would hate. He was an incredibly scientific minded, tech savvy guy. So I think he would love where we are technologically today. In the White House, he was fascinated by weapons and inventions and the telegraph and everything. And oh, he would have a cell phone with him all the time. He'd be looking things up on the web. I think he would love that and see how he could use that technology to better Americans and to better humanity. Not just himself.
Right. Okay, so let's get into it now. Sort of your realm of expertise. When exactly did Abraham Lincoln meet Mary, and how did they get married?
Yeah, well, they met in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln was, he was in his 30s at the time, kind of an older bachelor. Mary had moved there from Kentucky, was living with her sister and her brother-in-law, and they met at a dance. And Mary was the belle of the town. She was young, she was pretty, she was vivacious, she was rich. Her family was rich. She was extremely well educated. She had 12 years of schooling, more than most men did at the time. She could speak French, she could dance, she knew how to entertain. She was incredible, and everybody in town wanted her. She had so many suitors, she was literally batting them off with a stick. And Abraham Lincoln was a tall, uncouth guy from poverty in Kentucky. And, they met at a dance, and they had many things in common. Both of them, their mothers died young. They both loved poetry. They both loved politics. They loved Whig politics. They loved literature. So they had a lot in common. And so, a lot of people didn't understand it. She would be marrying down. And of course, he's only using her to marry up in his social station. Personally, I think they really loved each other. That's a contention in the Lincoln field. Did they or did they not? I think they did, which wasn't a perfect marriage, but there's always ups and downs. So they had so much going against them that if they didn't love each other, they never would have gotten married.
Huh. So it seems that she was sort of a perfect political wife, judging by sort of her character. What did she think of Lincoln's political career? Did she fit into that role of the political wife?
She does, yeah. See, that's a fascinating question. One of the things about Mary that's fascinating. She does seem like the perfect political wife. She had vast ambition for him, and she helped him whenever she could. But helping back then is different from the way wives help, or spouses, I should say, help their partners today in politics. So for Mary, her role was she was a hostess if people came to the house. She was a supporter in private and in public. Her main contribution was that she was an excellent judge of character, whereas Abraham Lincoln typically only saw the good in people. And so, especially in the White House years, she would always try to warn him off. This guy's a snake. He's a snake. He's trying to undermine you. Don't give him a job. Whereas Lincoln, he wouldn't listen to her because he thought everybody was good or could be good. Um, and so, she had a huge impact on him. And there's many things that say that she believed in him, maybe even when he didn't believe in himself. She believed he could be a U.S. senator when he really didn't think he was any better than Congress. She believed he could be a president when he really believed, well, I don't think I can go any higher than a senator. So, but she didn't craft policy. She didn't write his speeches. She didn't do any of those things that happened today. which is one of the big misnomers. But, you know, a lot of people who knew Lincoln and historians afterward said that if he didn't marry Mary Lincoln, he never would have been president. Basically, the point being, if he had married a woman who was less ambitious, who had just made his home life warm and fuzzy and something that he never wanted to leave, to be a lawyer, to go politicking around the state, then maybe he wouldn't have tried so hard. I think it's a fair argument. I don't know if I agree. I mean, before he met Mary Lincoln, he taught himself to read, he taught himself the law, he taught himself the art of surveying. He got elected to the state legislature multiple times, all before he met her. So clearly that drive was there. And, you know, as his law partner wrote a book, and in the book he said, Mr. Lincoln's political ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. And I think that sums it up exactly right. With or without Mary, that was his ambition.
Huh. That's interesting. I mean, I think it's a common thread with great men, great political leaders is having I don't think you can truly be a great man without a great woman there to lift you up. I've heard a lot of married men say you never truly become a man, you never truly become whole until you have, a woman, a wife, a spouse, whatever. But it does seem to be a common thread among great men throughout history that they have a woman in their corner to lift them up. And it does seem to be a commonality where the husband, the man, whatever, sort of is that trusting figure. I'm referencing Reagan, obviously. I'm a member of YAF, so I feel particularly close to Reagan and know a little bit more about him than I do other presidents. But him and Nancy were the same way. Reagan was a very trusting man, and Nancy was always there, trusting no one, always speculating about the people around him. So that does seem to be a commonality.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've thought through the years there's actually some very interesting similarities between Mary Lincoln and Nancy Reagan and their relationships with their husbands, and then who their husbands were and how they were so able to relate to people. You know, Nancy was into astrology. Mary Lincoln was into spiritualism. That's one of the big ones. It's kind of interesting.
That is interesting. So we say she's sort of a perfect political spouse, but when Lincoln's elected president, Mary is seen sort of as an outsider in Washington. No one really liked her as first lady. Why is that?
Yeah, that's so one of Mary's first and still one of the better biographers of Mary, Ruth Painter Randall. She wrote in her book, which is called Mary Lincoln Biography of a Marriage. She said Mary was perfectly fitted to be first lady, but you know, once she got to Washington, she could not do anything right by the standards of those around her. So no matter how well fitted she was for it, she was going to fail. And I 100% agree with that. So she was, you know, on paper, perfect as a political spouse, especially as the first lady. You know, as I've already said, very intelligent. She could dance, entertain. She knew how to dress well. She knew how to, you know, she redecorated the White House, which was a shabby bachelor's quarters under previous President Buchanan. She could talk French. She could talk politics. But there were two problems with her as first lady. Um, the first one, the simpler one, is that nobody accepted her. So when they got to Washington, so they were from Illinois, which at that time was, you know, backcountry Hickville, more or less. So immediately, nobody in Washington respected them because they're not from Washington. They haven't lived here except for 2 years when Lincoln was in Congress. So they're just, you know, Western hick rubes. They have no business being in Washington. So Northerners hated Mary. She was from Kentucky, which is a slave state. So they thought she was a Southern traitor. They didn't trust her. Southerners thought that she was a Northern traitor because she lived in Illinois, married a quote unquote black Republican. So all the Southerners hated her. And then all the Easterners, of course, as I said, they don't like Westerners. And then everybody in DC didn't like them because they're not part of the Beltway. Well, there wasn't a Beltway back then, but you know what I mean, of the interior. So nobody liked her. Nobody respected her. And Mary was a very strong-willed woman. So there's some great examples of, you know, in various research I've done where, you know, the women of Washington would come up to Mary at the White House and they would, if not give her advice, outright tell her what to do, how to do it. You're doing it wrong. And Mary was not the kind of person to just sit back and take it. She would basically say, didn't ask for your opinion. I'm the first lady. Who are you? Get out of my house. And so that just made things worse. So she couldn't win no matter what she did. I agree. But then, secondly, too, Mary did not have the emotional stability or temperament to be the first lady during the Civil War. If there was no war, she may have been one of the greatest first ladies ever. But she couldn't handle death. She couldn't handle the press just constantly criticizing her and her husband, the political enemies, the death threats against her husband, the stress of winning or losing the war. She couldn't handle those things emotionally, or mentally in some cases, and so that didn't help either. So it's a fascinating thing to look at her. And then I think part of her mental illness goes into it as well, because she, when she was first lady, she took bribes, she took payoffs for favors, among other illegal things she did. That's fact. That's established fact. And part of that was from she had delusions of poverty. And so she did these things because she felt like they needed the money. They were on, destitution's door, and if she didn't do this and get money, they wouldn't be able to afford to live. And part of it was a power trip. Part of it was because she was susceptible to flattery. If anybody flattered her, she would do whatever they wanted. So she's a very multifaceted, multi-layered individual, which is why I'm so fascinated by her. And I've done 5 books on her, and I'm working on number 6 right now. It's just she's very much like her husband. It not just it's not just who you see. There's a lot more to it, good and bad, that really shows who they were as a person, who they were in the White House, how that relates to the Civil War, even greater American history at the time.
That's so fascinating. Going back to what you said about Washington, D.C., it seems that nothing's really changed in sort of the elitist establishment atmosphere of Washington, D.C. A lot of Republicans talk about drain the swamp, but this isn't a new thing. It's kind of permeated throughout American history. And say what you want about Trump. I think this is one of the reasons that a lot of people hate him is he's seen as an outsider. He wasn't a politician. He came on the scene as this, real estate TV guy, and all of a sudden he's the president. I think that's a reason a lot of people don't like him. And we're seeing that play out right now before our eyes with his cabinet picks. His cabinet picks are very unorthodox, a lot of outsiders, and I think he's purposely being disruptive.
I agree, absolutely. And I think one reason a lot of people vote for him is because he's not a politician. And so, because people are tired of politicians, even back then, even when talking about Lincoln, politician is a dirty word. And so when you apply that to Lincoln, a lot of people get upset. Like, oh no, he was a consummate politician. He knew how to play the game better than anybody, which is one reason so many senators and congressmen didn't like him, because he outwitted them and he outsmarted them. But he's just supposed to be some Western hick rube from Illinois, but he was smarter than all of them. And so, and I agree. I think that's a very interesting comparison with him and Trump. Um, there's so many comparisons you can make. Like when W. Bush was running against John Kerry, it was so similar to Lincoln running against McClellan. It was, are we going to keep fighting the Civil War? Are we going to surrender? Bush Kerry was, are we going to keep fighting in Iraq? Are we just going to pull out and just leave a vacuum? I mean, that's a very basic comparison, but that was, I remember at the time thinking that was an interesting history repeating itself in a certain way.
Yeah, 100%. It's one of the biggest reasons we study history is to take the lessons of the past and apply them to the present or to the future. But, we talk about Mary Lincoln's inability to handle trauma. And a lot of people would think about the assassination on Abraham Lincoln and sort of how that affected her, but she had a lot of tragedy and trauma throughout her life prior to that. Can we talk about how many kids they had? Because I know some of the children they had died early, and that had a big impact on her.
It did, yeah. Mary had she had a lot of trials and tribulations in her life that impacted on her character, who she was. Some of it being mental illness, and some of it just being personality and character traits. One of my favorite books about Mary Lincoln is actually not even about Mary Lincoln. It's called House of Abraham Lincoln and the Todd Family, and it's about Abraham Lincoln's relationship with Mary's family. She was one of was it I think 14 brothers and sisters. Half were from her mother. Her mother died in childbirth. Her father remarried, and then he had 8 more kids or so afterward. And so it's about Lincoln's relationship with these people, this rich aristocratic family, and how they helped him or hindered him in his career. But what that book showed me was how Mary Lincoln grew up and what kind of family space she grew up. And the book is does a great job explaining how. So they had this house with 14 kids, not necessarily all at once because of age ranges, but there was parents, there was slaves. They had a lot of slaves. Back in the day, if someone came to visit, they'd stay for a month or two. You'd have family who lived not far away coming to stay for a few days. Her father was a banker and a politician. His office was in the house. So you've got people. So it's just this big roiling cauldron of people constantly, most of them being children. And so Mary always had to be the center of attention as an older person. Why is that? Well, when she was a child in a house like that, how do you get any attention? By making people notice you. So that's just a basic example of why she was the way she was personality wise. So that's I find a very interesting thing as far as her personality. She could be one reason I think it was bipolar. She could be loving and wonderful and kind and generous one minute, and then in the blink of an eye she would be just vicious and mean and self-centered. And some of that was bipolar. Some of that's the way her family is. I mean, when you read about the Todd family, you read some letters from her brothers and sisters. They were all like that. There's a quote somewhere that said Mary was just like her family because the Todds were all good haters, which is how she was, and that's her son Robert was a good hater as well later in his life. And so there's a lot of family things that come in when we read about people, historical figures. Sometimes we forget about the context in which they grew up and lived and worked and did whatever they did, because you're surrounded by people all the time. And her family definitely had a huge impact on Mary and why she was who she was.
Hmm. That's interesting. So she had to. A lot of women do this. She had to sort of put herself out there and be this animated, larger than life figure in order to get attention in a bustling household. Do you think that I'm just kind of brainstorming here, but do you think that she sort of put on this personality, this facade to get attention, and then it sort of consumed her, and she became that uh greedy for attention type of figure to sort of lash out and do these crazy things just to get attention?
Yeah, I think she definitely needed attention. That's one reason why, as I said when she was first lady, anyone who flattered her would get anything they wanted from her. Whether it was just by words or whether they gave her presents or things. She loved attention. But, like in Springfield, before she was married, when she was married, Mary would be the one, almost like kind of like a movie, maybe not a bad movie, but there's a room full of people, but there's that one woman who's dressed a little nicer, who has the fan going a little faster, whose laugh is just a little bit louder. And yes, she's beautiful and she's intelligent, and but she's making everyone look at her. And I that's how I see Mary. And I don't know that that necessarily has to be a negative thing, but that's exactly the way I think she was, which is why so many men courted her when she was younger. But then, I do think part of that was affectation, especially as first lady. She grew up in the aristocracy. Then she married down to Lincoln, who was lower middle class when they married. By the time they get to the White House, he was upper middle class, very successful lawyer. But they weren't rich by any means. And so when they went to the White House, Mary suddenly was back in the aristocracy, even above the aristocracy. And so she thought of herself as a queen, and she acted like a queen. She expected everyone to treat her as a queen and give her anything she wanted. And so I think part of her affectations were acting in that regal manner, which there's letters and diaries from many people throughout the Civil War talking about the way she acted or didn't act and how ridiculous it was.
Yeah, I didn't really pick up on this when doing my research prior to this conversation, but I do think now that I think about it that it I mean, she definitely had the mental illnesses you talk about, but I think it could have been an act to because she had that void for attention, in her heart, and I think it could have been sort of an act in order to get any attention whatsoever because she did have that hunger for attention. But going back to the kids,
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to talk
how
about the
many
kids. Yeah.
no, it's all no, it's all good. So how many kids did she have, and, what was her relationship with them? How many of them died early?
Yeah. So the Lincolns had four children. Robert was the oldest. And then they had their second son was Eddie. Eddie died in 1850, just before his fourth birthday, from what was probably tuberculosis, and which just destroyed, as it would destroy any parent, but it destroyed Mary. One of the first big major moments of her life. And right around the same time that Eddie died, Mary's father died and her grandmother died, all in the same time, within a matter of months. So shortly after Eddie died, then they had Willie Lincoln, and then 3 years later came Tad, their youngest. So there were ultimately three children. Eddie died so young. And then Willie died in the White House when he was 11 from typhoid fever from bad drinking water. And then Tad died when he was 17 years old in 1871 after the assassination. So Robert was the only Lincoln child to grow to adulthood. But the relationships are interesting because so Willie and Tad were like best friends playing together in Springfield and in the White House. There's lots of articles and books and things about them. Robert, his playmate would have been Eddie, but Eddie died, and so Robert was incredibly close to Mary, and almost like they were best friends. Because remember, Lincoln was gone 6 to 9 months a year, riding the circuit or doing politics or just being in the law office. So
Running the country?
right?
Yeah.
So Robert and Mary were incredibly close. And that was that way all the way up until Robert had his mother committed to the sanitarium in 1875. And so, the Lincolns as parents is interesting. I think if I had met them, I would have hated them as a parent myself. They let their children do anything, literally. There was it Lincoln used to say, I am happy that my children are free and unencumbered by parental tyranny. Love is the chain whereby to bind a child to its parents. I think that's the quote. But literally, he could do anything. And so the kids could do anything. And so, like William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, would write about it. He'd say, Willie and Tad would come to the office and they would, overturn chairs and spill ink pens and tear up papers and destroy the office. And Mr. Lincoln would just sit there, not even noticing. Or if he did notice, he would just laugh, thinking it's a great joke. Whereas Herndon wanted to smack the kids and kick them out of the office. And that's how they were in the White House as well. And, people who met them were just like, I can't believe his kids are such horrible monsters. So that's interesting. And that's another thing about him, is that freedom or is that lack of any kind of laws or restrictions at all? Which one's better,
Yeah, I think that would also, frustrate me very much. I'm not a parent, but that I don't envision that to be my sort of parenting and governing style. So Robert is the only one to survive to adulthood. 3 of the 4 children die relatively early, and, you know, 2 of these are prior to Lincoln's assassination, right? Okay, so is this where Mary really starts to unravel?
Well, there's different theories. A lot of people then and now think that the assassination pushed Mary over the edge, that she was never totally stable. But the assassination, she was holding her husband's hand when he got shot in the head, leaning on him. So how horrible would that be? Robert Lincoln, the oldest son, he always believed it was the assassination that unhinged her. Some people then and now think it was the death of Willie. So Willie, as parents, none of us have favorite children, but of course we all do. And Willie was the favorite parent, the favorite child of both Lincolns. And when he died, they were just devastated. And so some people think it was Willie's death that pushed her over the edge. Personally, I think that it was Tad's death in 1871 that really pushed her over the final edge. If you think about it back then, a lot of people, a lot of women lost far more children than Mary did, lost multiple husbands because of disease and whatnot. And they could all handle it just fine, in a normal amount of grief. But, Mary, if you look back all the way to her childhood, she had mental issues. She was up and down, up and down. So, she'd be doing fine. Then Eddie died and she went down. Then she got better. And then Willie died and she went farther down. Then she got better. And then her husband died. And then finally she was starting to come out of it. And so Abraham Lincoln was really her pillar, I think, to sanity. And, she said in one letter, she said, he was from my 18th year, husband, lover, father, brother, all to me, truly my all. And when he died, there was a huge void there. So she immediately clung on to Tad, because Robert, by this time, shortly after the assassination, he started working in a law firm. He got married. He had kids. He had a life. And Mary she barely ever let Tad out of her sight, quite frankly. And she had very few friends. She didn't speak to family because she treated everybody so badly during the White House years that nobody wanted to talk to her. So all she had was Tad. And so when he died, she had nobody, because Robert was a grown-up. And quite frankly, when you read his letters and things, you can see some exasperation creeping in. He's like, I've got a job and a wife and kids and a house and all this stuff. And mother, come on, give me a break. You can tell that. So when she wants a lot of attention, he's not necessarily giving it to her for various reasons. So, and it's really, it was 1875 where Robert had her committed, but she had signs long before that. So, that's my take, is that Tad is what pushed her over the edge. But, when she was committed in 1875, all the newspapers, all the people, everybody, if you read anything about it at the time, almost to a person, they all said the same thing. Like, oh yeah, that figures. I'm surprised she didn't go crazy 10 years ago. So yeah, it was not a surprise to anybody.
It's so tragic. I mean, it's hard to look back in hindsight and blame any of them for the way they reacted to the situation. I mean, if you lose, I mean, three of your four children, your husband gets assassinated right next to you. I mean, that would drive anyone crazy. It's really easy to empathize with them here. And in terms of Robert, like, he's got a life of his own, a wife, children, a job, and he's got this crazy mom. It's a lot to deal with. It's really emotionally draining. So I mean, you really it's just so tragic. I mean, because we can't imagine, anyone can't imagine what that would feel like to have that level of tragedy and trauma in your life.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's part of just understanding. Like, I agree with you. Yeah, you can't blame her for what she did. And actually, when you understand that she had mental illness, a lot of her bizarre behaviors actually make more sense and make her more understandable. And when you understand that Robert at the time was a Victorian gentleman, head of the household, if he didn't protect his mother, he failed as a man. Then that also makes you understand a little bit more why he did what he did. So yeah, that's, as a historian, that's what I always try to do, is just to understand and not cast blame, which is where you get a lot of misinterpretation, especially with Mary Lincoln. Is this is the biggest one, is her mental status.
Yeah, I think empathy is one of the most important traits that you can have as a historian. But let's speak to the being committed to the insane asylum, Belouf Place Sanitarium, right?
Bellevue.
Bellevue. Okay, apologies. So you say Robert commits her in 1875. What is the process there?
So that's so the law had only changed a couple of years before this happened. So previously in Illinois, a man could commit a woman or a child to a mental institution merely on his say so. She's crazy, lock her up. And that's all it took. Then there was a woman who I'm blanking on her name right now, but basically her husband locked her up. He was I don't remember. It's like something like he was a Baptist and she was a Presbyterian, and so she disagreed with him on something on the grounds of religion. And he said, "Yeah, no, you're crazy." And he got a doctor, and the doctor said, "Yeah, she's crazy." And they locked her up in an asylum for years. And she ultimately fought her way out. She fought, and she got the law changed. And so by the time of Mary's trial, because she had to go to trial, the law was a little different. So at the time, Robert couldn't just say, "Yeah, she's crazy, lock her up." So he consulted with 7 medical experts and 3 of his father's closest friends and told them all. Some of the doctors had treated her, some of them hadn't. They only knew what Robert told them and what Lincoln's friends of 30, 40 years had told him. And so then they went to trial. Mary had to be arrested and brought to court, although um, Lincoln's friend Leonard Swett, he persuaded her to come to court rather than be arrested and put in handcuffs. And then there was a trial, and Mary had a lawyer. Robert had a lawyer. He had a couple lawyers, and they argued the case. It had to be a jury trial, and at least one of the jurors had to be a medical doctor. And so after 2 hours of testimony, the jury took I think it was less than 10 minutes to find her. That at the time, they didn't have a lot of different words. It was just she is insane. So at the time, they could have just put her in a state asylum, which is kind of like a one flew over the cuckoo's nest kind of horrible, horrible place nobody should ever go. Of course, Robert didn't allow that to happen. He had her put in a private asylum that was, it had um, modern facilities. It was a big, beautiful house, and there was no medication or anything. It was moral therapy. So there was talking, there was walking and exercising and tending to it was world class rose gardens, and Mary could go in for carriage rides and things like that. So it was not a horrible place at all. I tend to explain it sometimes as like probably when Hollywood starlets go for drug treatment, kind of something like that, almost like a resort in a way. So Mary was supposed to be there for 1 year, and then after that, they could revisit her case. And after 4 months, she was allowed to go live with her sister in Springfield, Illinois, instead of staying at the sanitarium. But she was still under court order of insanity, but she was just staying there because she made this big public clamor about it, saying, "I'm not crazy." The doctor finally said, "I can't treat her anymore." So let her go there with a nurse. And so 1 year later, um, they went back to court, and the court pronounced her restored to reason. And Mary immediately fled to Europe because she was afraid that Robert would try to have her committed again. And they didn't speak for about 5 years. There's a lot more to it than that. Those are just the high points. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, this is where because they were close before this, right?
oh, they were incredibly close. And if you read Mary's letters, after the assassination, Mary constantly gives Robert the highest praise she ever could or would give anyone. She would say, "Dear Robert grows more and more every day like his sainted father." But part of Mary's mental illness was she had a delusions of poverty and delusions about money. And she thought Robert was trying to steal her money, which he wasn't, but she thought he was. And so Robert was afraid in all of her symptoms, not only afraid for her life, which the doctors warned him about, but he was also afraid for her financial well-being and her ability to live on her own, because she just spent it constantly, and he was afraid she would bankrupt herself, which again would then be his fault because he, as the man of the family, is not protecting her. And so one reason he had her committed was that he was put in charge of her money, so she couldn't spend it all. And he didn't spend any of it, but she thought he wanted to steal it. So that was a big part of the insanity period, was an argument over money.
Yeah, so their relationship completely collapses and deteriorates. But if you ever want to sort of visit a dark aspect of history. Look up the way that people were treated in terms of insane back in the day. I mean, the conditions of insane asylums and the way and the ease people were committed with. I mean, people with mild, what today would be considered like mild psychological disorders or illnesses, would just instantly be sent to these horrid, horrific, inhumane, insane asylums.
Absolutely. Yeah, I read a lot of articles in the Journal of American Insanity, which is not a title that would survive today. But yeah, to read articles back then about how they looked, how they viewed disease, how they treated disease, it's pretty fascinating. Some of it was pretty intelligent and elevated from my layman's standpoint. Some of it seemed rather dark ages. So
Yeah, it's really dark. But so here's where we get into this is the coolest thing ever. You are the man who found the infamous Mary Lincoln Insane Asylum letters almost 100 years after they were lost. You just like this, you found this lost treasure that people have been searching for decades. And this is the coolest thing to me because one of my favorite movies ever is National Treasure, and this just gives off National Treasure vibes. I mean, this is like a treasure hunt that you were successful. It's like, I heard you talking about it in one of your lectures. This is every historian's dream to find some old dusty chest in an attic filled with historical treasure. So, can you tell the story of how you found the letters, how you knew about the letters? What was the process there?
absolutely. Oh yeah, it's one of my favorite stories to tell. It is every historian's dream. So I was, I've been, like I said, doing research and writing about Lincoln and his family for years and years, and so I was researching my biography of Robert Lincoln. So I was up at his house, Hildene, in Manchester, Vermont, which is a private site, but it was in the family up until the 1980s, 1970s. Sorry, and so I went up there to do some research, and this was at a time when they were only open for tours in the summer. So it was March, I think. So I went up there, and the curator at the time, he set me up on the dining room table, like Robert's original dining room table. There's a portrait of Robert that is in the wall, staring down at me. There was no heat, there was no lights because everything was shut off because it was wintertime, and just the entire wall to my right was windows because it was like a patio dining room in a way. And so I go back to the secretary's office, and there's an entire wall full. It's this beautiful wooden wall, and it's full of wooden boxes and wooden drawers and things, and it's full of all of Robert's and his secretary's papers, and they'd been there ever since the family lived there, ever since Robert died. And he gave me a pair of gloves, and he said, okay, you look through these. He was relatively new as a curator. Before him, there had just been a community member who just kind of sat in the house and just made sure nobody stole anything. So this curator was still going through the house to see what was there historically. And so, he said, yeah, if you find anything cool, tell me. So I pulled down the first box. I've got these white gloves on, and there's just inches of dust on top of it. No fingerprints. Like they've probably been sitting there for decades, maybe since Robert died in the 1920s. So I'm going through all these boxes, and I found a letter that referred to Mary's letters from the asylum. And as you said, they've been called, Mary's lost insanity letters. And every Lincoln scholar knows about them. Many had tried to find them. Nobody had ever could. A lot of people assumed they'd been destroyed. So I found this letter mentioning these letters. So I knew exactly what this was. So then, of course, I'm rifling through every box to see what else might be there. Excuse me. And I found a second letter about these letters. And that was all I found at Hildene. But basically, I found, these two letters were saying that a friend of Mary's named Myra Bradwell is the woman Mary wrote these letters to. Her granddaughter had owned the letters, had written a book, and was going to publish the book. This was in 1927. This was 1 year after Robert died. And she wrote to Robert's widow as a courtesy to say, hey, look, I've got this, I've done this, just want to let you know. So Robert's wife wrote back and said, oh, wonderful. Well, let's meet up and maybe I can help you with your book. and all their lawyers were on the documents. So I've been to like every Lincoln archive in America, and I've never found anything, nor has anyone. So I thought, let me see if I can let me track down Myra Bradwell's descendants first. And so I did. I found her last living descendant. He was living in Wisconsin, and he had a bunch of legal documents about this. And what the documents showed was that when Mary Harlan Lincoln, Robert's wife, said, "Hey, let's meet in D.C. and maybe I can help you with your book," there was another letter that said, "Actually, you know what? I changed my mind. You can't print your book, and if you do, I will sue you." And so Mary's attorney, so there were a bunch of legal documents sent back and forth. And Mary Harlan Lincoln ultimately she bought the letters from Mrs. Pritchard was her name. She bought she bought out the publishing contract. She bought the manuscript, and she suppressed everything. And so I had the legal documentation side of it, but not the letters. So then I thought, wow, well, since it's a legal matter, let me try to track down the children of Robert's attorney. He had the same attorney for about 30 years. And so I did. I found his son, and I'll never forget. It was an August day. Called him up on the phone, and I said, "I'm doing a book about Robert Lincoln," and he's, "Oh, Daddy loved Robert Lincoln. I remember riding on the Pullman cars with Mrs. Lincoln and going to Hill Dean, and oh, it was so wonderful." And we were chatting for a few minutes, and I was just about to say, "Well, the reason I'm calling is," and he says, "You know what? We just found Daddy's old steamer trunk up in the attic, and it's got some letters that Mary Todd Lincoln wrote when she was in an insane asylum. Do you think those are worth anything?" And I said, "Oh my God, that's why I was calling you." So they had this trunk. It even was labeled Towers Lincoln trunk. It's a big steamer trunk. It was up in their attic, and it was up, in the corner. The label was facing the wall. It had been up there for like 50 years. Nobody knew it was there. And the only reason they found it was because they were moving. So they were cleaning out the house. And they had only found it very shortly before I found them. And so they were very wonderful people. So there were three siblings, and one of them lived in New York City. And the daughter, she had the trunk. So I flew out to New York City, and they let me go through the trunk and see what was in there. And in there were the letters, the Lincoln side of all the legal documentation, and the unpublished manuscript that had been suppressed. It was all in there. And so then between all the three places I'd looked, I had the entire story right there of what had happened. So that was amazing. And then it was so then the funny thing was at first when I revealed my discovery, um, all the so at this time I was very young. I'd published articles. I hadn't done a book yet. I was in my 20s. And like the Lincoln people didn't believe it. Like, who's this kid who thinks he found these letters? What a joke. And then when it was proved that it was real, then it turned into, well, who the hell is this kid thinks he can find these letters we've all been looking for? And everybody was angry at me for, I was kind of an upstart for finding these letters. And interesting thing though, today, to this day still, this was in 2007 that I found these letters. And if you go to the Lincoln Presidential Library today, I believe, I haven't been there in a couple of years, but they have a program there called Ghosts of the Library, which is a wonderful program all about archives and Lincoln history and stuff. And part of the program says, "And what about Mary Lincoln's lost letters from the asylum? Do you think anybody will ever find those?" And I remember I went there after I'd found the letters, and I was sitting in the audience thinking, yeah, I know I found them. Somebody will find them because I did. But my discovery was it was actually uh, AP picked it up as a news story. It was published in a magazine, but they never changed the exhibit, and a lot of people, they didn't like it or believe it at first for whatever reason. But yeah, it was such a great day. And then my book, I still think that's probably my favorite book that I've written, my first one, The Madness of Mary Lincoln. So it's all about Mary's mental health from childhood to death. And then the last chapter is the full story of how I found the letters. And then there's an appendix printing all the letters. And so it was pretty great. You know, I'm always looking. I've found some great unknown things since then, but nothing that quite is at that level.
God, That is truly so incredible. I mean, I cannot imagine what was the moment. I mean, I asked you earlier about the metaphysical feeling when you were sitting in the Lincoln home. What's that moment feel like? Like as you're climbing up the ladder to the attic, you first lay eyes on this chest covered in dust, untouched for decades, and you pull it out and you open the chest, and inside are these letters that historians have been searching for decades, and you're the guy, this young up and comer, you're the guy who finds them. What does that moment feel like?
Oh, it was great. It was so basically when I went to New York City to look at them. So these had been in their house in I think it was in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which they sold because they were moving. So they sent the trunk to the one daughter's house in New York City, and she lived in an apartment. And so I went there. So I walked into her place. It was actually on the Upper West Side, very rich areas of town, I think. I don't know New York City very well, but and so I walked into the dining room and the trunk was just sitting on the table closed. And so it was, and I had, this was 2007. So I had a little point and click camera with me, So I took a picture. It was just, I can't even describe how amazing it felt to look at it. It's this big old trunk. And so I remember when I opened it up, first thing I did, I could smell the old historic paper. Actually, I was surprised. I kind of figured I thought it was going to be a little bit more Hollywood. Like I'd open it up and just this mass of papers all mingled together. But it was all very neatly done. Things were in envelopes, they were all in nice lines. There was a multi page index to what was in each envelope. And so, but then it was an incredible feeling. And then that was immediately replaced with, this is going to take a long time to look through all these envelopes because there was hundreds, maybe thousands of documents in there. I didn't count, obviously, but most of it was from Robert and his children and his grandchildren. But there was Mary Lincoln's letters. I believe there was one letter from Mary Lincoln's father in there, and nothing from Abraham Lincoln in there. But it was just incredible, and this family was so nice. They let me stay there. They actually let me stay in their house, and I got to spend a few hours looking through this and make some photocopies, and they let me use it all in my book, which of course they didn't have to. So yeah, it was amazing. Sometimes you think like, boy, I hope that wasn't the highest point I'm going to get in my historian
I
career.
know.
I'm
I
only,
I hope I didn't peak in my 20s.
right.
One of the interesting things about that story that I heard you talking about is they actually only discovered the trunk and the letters 7 days before you called them.
Yeah, about that. Yeah, it was not long before I found them because they were moving, so they didn't really know it was there, and they didn't really know what they had too. They asked me, they're like, so are these? They said, are these worth anything? But I think what they meant was historically valuable.
But I mean, at this point, you had been studying the Lincoln family for probably years at this point, and these lost, infamous Mary Lincoln insanity letters, you called them and they'd only discovered them days before. So, if they discovered them 7 days before, if you had called them 8 days, they're like, "Oh, no, we don't." 8 days before, they're like, "Oh, no, we don't have anything." So, I mean, you can imagine just the coincidence is magnificent. You'd been studying for years, and then the time frame comes down to just a couple days where if you were off by 1 day, this never would have happened.
Yeah, and that's the thing about being a historian and looking for items that have never been found before. Um, a lot of it is hard work, but a lot of it is luck in a certain way. I actually just recently saw. Right now, I'm doing the collected letters of Mary Lincoln. There was a book of her letters done in the 1970s, but obviously that needs a lot of updating. So, very general terms. I found some letters that hadn't been published before that were, on an auction website or something, and they led me to other things. And I saw something about Mary owed debts to this fur business in New York City after the assassination, and she owed them a lot of money, and she wasn't paying, so they hired an attorney to sue her. And I've never heard that before. And so I'm like, where did that come from? And so that was on Wikipedia. And I'm like, anybody who does history or journalism or anything, you never trust Wikipedia because anybody can put anything on there they want. And so I spent days trying to verify these things. I couldn't get anywhere. So finally, I emailed the Wikipedia guy who posted it, and it was real. And he had all these original letters in his possession. That was, again, part of that was hard work. Part of that was luck that I even found it on Wikipedia. Part of it was, even trying to contact him. So yeah, you never know. It's amazing to me that there's so much history that is still unknown and undiscovered that's out there, despite how much we think we might. Especially Lincoln. Lincoln's the most written about American in world history, and yet there are still some unknown things to learn. Uh, not not as much as we'd like, but there are still some unknown things out there.
Yeah, it's truly fascinating when you do think about sort of the lost realms of history. I mean, you think back to the burning of the Library of Alexandria and all this history that's been lost throughout history. Like when we look back at history, we do not even understand even close to the full picture of history. I wonder I mean, as history gets more recent, we'll understand more because it's more documented. But looking back at ancient history, we maybe have like 2% of the picture.
Absolutely. It's oh yeah, the the burning of Alexandria. That's one of the things that just makes my heart sink every time I think of it. Think of all the knowledge that was lost there.
Yeah. And same thing with the Egyptians. I mean, we don't know how they built the pyramids. There's a lot of theories that I find very fascinating that they were actually more technologically advanced than we are today. It was just in a different way that we don't understand. You know what I mean? Like the way they built the pyramids was probably super technologically advanced, but it was just in a different way because we understand technology as computers and chips and AI and stuff like that today, but they had different technology.
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting as I'm going through, working on my various history things. It's amazing how many times you find things where um, people will admit, I burned my family letters, or he burned these, or right before he died, he made his wife promise that she would burn all of his letters. And so there's so much, like you said, that we don't know. And one thing that always strikes me as very depressing is I read somewhere in some book that the last president to actually handwrite anything of consequence was Ronald Reagan. And H.W. Bush, he wrote a lot of notes on sticky notes. But then after him, Clinton, and going forward, it's all email. And think about when you write an email, you don't sit down. When you handwrite a letter, you think about things, and you're considering it, and you write a lot of words. When you dash off an email, you're not really thinking. So what I always think of as a someone who loves presidential history, is like, think about, or just U.S. history, how much knowledge we're losing because of digitization and emails. Like, we're not going to get into the thought processes really of presidents just to go to the top of the ladder, or anybody really. I mean, think about, I'm fascinated by Reagan as well. You said you were. And one thing I've learned from reading, it always takes, that everybody says, like, yeah, at least 20 years after a president dies before his presidency starts to be understood objectively. And so, after Reagan died, people were starting to look a little bit, but people were actually reading his letters, his writings, his speeches, which he wrote most of them himself, his old radio programs, which he wrote all himself. And even his worst enemies realized he was a smart guy, and he understood politics, and he understood messaging, and he was a good man too. And these are things you only understand if you read what he wrote. You know, like, Bill Clinton, say what you want about him, but we're never going to understand him the way we do Reagan because of emails he wrote. That's just, or any president after Clinton. He was just the first example because that's when it started. But so that's a sad thing for me as a historian to think about. That's one reason I like earlier, 19th century, maybe early 20th century history, because there is still documentation out there to find.
And not only do we not really get a glimpse into the thought process, but a lot of this stuff will just get lost into cyberspace and never seen again. The thing about letters is we have the physical papers to be preserved and kept.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. How easy. I mean, I know it's easy enough to burn or shred a letter, but it seems to me, it seems like it's a lot easier to just hit delete and something's gone.
Yeah, exactly. So, did Robert and Mary ever reconcile?
They did, yeah. It took about 5 years. It was in 1881. Mary was she was in Europe for 5 years, and she was getting older. She was in very, very poor physical health. And so she decided to come back to America, and she went back to Springfield, Illinois, moved back in with her sister, whom she'd lived with before. So she was living there, and Robert, by 1881, he was the Secretary of War for President James A. Garfield. So he was in DC. And so we don't know how their reconciliation came about, but to me, I think it's very logical and almost obvious in a way to assume that Mary's older sister, Elizabeth, with whom she was living, arranged it because Robert was very close to his aunt. And Mary's sister was almost more like a mother figure to her than a sister. And so I'm sure that she somehow got them together. So Robert, he was making a trip out to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas to inspect the fort. And on his way through, he stopped in Springfield and saw his mother for the first time. And, during that whole 5 years, Robert held nothing against his mother. There are letters where he even says that, but she held a lot against him. So, yeah, so they buried the hatchet, so to speak, then. And then after that, Robert visited his mother every week or two. After that, he had a daughter by then, so he would often bring his daughter, whose name was Mary, named after his mother. Mary went to New York for a couple months to see a physician there. And so when she was in New York, Robert visited her every week. And so, yeah, that was about a little over a year before Mary passed away that they were able to rekindle their relationship a bit.
That's nice. We haven't really got to give Robert his credit. He was actually a very accomplished man in life. I mean, you just mentioned he was Garfield's Secretary of War. Um, so what's sort of his life? I mean, he's a very accomplished man. How does he grapple with the legacy of his father? Because that's there's got to be a psychological term for sons and descendants of great men, like this complex, this like maybe inferiority complex they have.
Yeah, that's one of the stories out there about Robert that I don't know if I believe it or not because of who wrote it. But yeah, Robert's a fascinating guy, which is why I wrote. I spent 10 years writing a book on him. But yeah, so he was a lawyer. He eventually became one of the biggest lawyers in Chicago in the Midwest. He was Secretary of War for Garfield and Arthur. He became Minister to Great Britain under President Harrison, and then he became the president of the Pullman Car Company. And when he switched over to business side rather than law, he was president or board member, chairman of the board of numerous companies, always cutting edge, telephone companies, car companies, um, railroad companies. And so he was a self-made multimillionaire. He was truly a captain of industry at the time, along with Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan. He was with all those guys at the time. But among all that, Robert was the last living Lincoln. And so, yeah, he was the keeper of his father's legacy and, of course, all of his father's papers and heirlooms and things. So, Robert had to deal with that every day of his life. And there was one person who wrote a story saying that Robert did live under an inferiority complex. The quote supposedly is like Robert said to him, nobody wanted me for Secretary of War. They wanted Abraham Lincoln's son. Nobody wanted me for Minister to Great Britain. They wanted Abraham Lincoln's son. I don't know. As I said, I don't believe the source. I don't know that Robert would have said that in general or even to that guy who wrote it down. But I mean, there's no doubt Robert became Secretary of War because he was his father's son. That's why Garfield nominated him. But Robert did such a good job that then, he became Minister to Great Britain. He did such a good job that people began to see he is a smart, intelligent, worthy guy, and he's also Abraham Lincoln's son. So definitely people traded on his name for him at first. He never traded on it. There's tons of letters where he gets offered every position you could think of, and he pretty much says no all the time. He said, I have a family, I have a law practice, but more than that, anybody who's if I took this job, anybody would say, why does he deserve that job? He has no experience. It just doesn't make any sense. So, yeah, I think, now, of course, I could be wrong. Maybe he did. But, back then, he was a Victorian era guy. So they didn't, he's not going to write a letter spouting off all of his insecurities, at least not that I've ever found.
What's the one story where he was playing golf and someone came up to him and was asking him questions about Lincoln and he said, "My father was a great man, but I am not."
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. There's a picture that I found. I found it in a newspaper. I've never found the original, but yeah, he was golfing in Georgetown at a golf course in Georgetown because he had a house later in life. So Robert lived in Chicago for, I don't know, 50 years or so. Then he had his summer home in Vermont, and eventually they sold their Chicago house and they bought a house in Georgetown, Washington D.C. And so Robert was an avid golfer, and so one day he was sitting on a bench. This is the photo. He's sitting on a bench, got a golf club in his lap and a cigar in his hand. He was a huge cigar smoker. So to me, this picture just kind of encapsulates him as a person. But yeah, a reporter came up to him and wanted to ask him all these questions. And yeah, Robert finally said, listen, my father was a great man. I am not. And he got up and walked away because he got tired of people always wanting to write about him. And that's what, Robert only twice or three times maybe in his whole life did he ever stand up and speak about his father. He always said, it's not my place. Let the historians and the writers and the poets do it. It's not my place to say things, which I appreciate. But I also think part of it too is that I don't think he wanted himself he didn't want to kind of impinge himself onto his father's legacy. Like a good example is when he was president of the Pullman Car Company, the black porters wanted to get a raise in their wages. And actually, I'm sorry, no, let me back up. Before that happened, Booker T. Washington and I think W.E.B. Du Bois, they approached Robert about him, that's what it was, allowing blacks to ride in the white cars. And Robert basically said, no, yeah, I'm a businessman. I'm not interested in your politics. I'm not going to worry about it. And of course, they called him racist, and people still do call him racist. I call him a businessman. But also, I have to wonder, and so some people have told me that I'm looking too deeply into this, but I have to wonder, like his father freed the slaves. If Robert had suddenly come out as the first millionaire businessman to desegregate all of his train cars. This was in the 1920s, 19 teens, excuse me. Where would that have put him and his reputation? Would you talk about Abraham Lincoln, you talk about how his son desegregated cars in the 19 teens. I don't know. Did Robert even want to be lumped in there? His father had his own legacy. Robert didn't want to jump into it. So, yeah, I can even imagine how complicated his life was as the heir of Lincoln, let alone everything else he did in his life.
I mean, to sort of relate it to others, this thread of commonality that a lot of sons and daughters of great men, they want nothing to do with it. They want to create. Psychology is so interesting because for example, if your dad's an alcoholic, some people might be an alcoholic, some people might not. Some people who are sons of great men are kind of spoiled by that and they play into it and they're this aristocrat. But some of them want absolutely nothing to do with it and they want to be their own man and create their own legacy. So it's interesting to analyze that. But you say that his the mainstream narrative around Robert Lincoln is that he was this horrible person, but you obviously disagree with that. So can you speak to that?
There's really a couple of specific reasons why Robert has such a negative reputation throughout history. Um, a lot of Lincoln scholars just ignore him and they don't think he's worth anything. And they think that he has nothing to say about his father, so he doesn't interest them because it doesn't help them in their historical work, which I understand. But I think that was a choice Robert made. As in May 1865, he wrote a letter to historian Josiah Hyland, and And Holland wanted to say, "Can you tell me everything you remember about your dad? I'm writing a book." And Robert said, "Well, I was at college during the war. I was never around. I really don't remember anything. But you talk to these friends of his." And as I noticed as I was, working on this book for so many years, Robert knew a lot about his father, and he wrote about it all the time in letters to friends and colleagues and things. But he didn't write a book, and he never wrote articles because he didn't want to be the target of everybody. Oh, Robert, let's go to Robert, which they did anyways. But so I think that was a calculated decision on his part. But really, Robert Lincoln, it's very interesting because when he was younger, when his father was alive, Robert was a great storyteller, just like his father. He was a hilarious jokester, just like his father. And he was very fun and lively, the life of the party, just like his father. After the assassination, Robert is no longer like that for obvious reasons. But then, even when his sadness wears away, he becomes very shy and reticent. And because everyone's just, if you think about Robert, one thing I always tell people, I'm like, think about it. Every single day of his life, people were badgering him about his father. They want information, they want trinkets, they want letters, they want signatures, they want you to look at a work of art they created, they want you to look at something they wrote. It's just, it never ended for him for 60 years. And so he just didn't like talking about it. But as he got older, he hated the press because he felt like the press got everything wrong. Half of it because they were idiots, and half of it because they just made it up. And so Robert wouldn't talk to them because they would just make it up. So because he wouldn't talk to them, the reporters would just make it up. And so because they made it up, he wouldn't talk to them. So it's just this vicious circle. And so he tons of negative publicity about him, especially as he got older and was a millionaire captain of industry, because journalists didn't like him because he didn't like them. Another big reason is that Robert, he was a corporate attorney before he became a corporate leader. And so a lot of people then and now say, "Oh, he's so unlike his father. Oh, he's Abraham Lincoln was a man of the people. Robert's just a rich prick. And no, it's so unlike his father." And I disagree with you. Abraham Lincoln was a corporate attorney too. People forget that. He worked for the railroad. He got a $5,000 fee one day. So I think Robert turned into exactly the person his father wanted him to be, a highly successful, respected lawyer and businessman. But, that's what we were talking about earlier, the legend of Lincoln. Oh, Lincoln's this everyman who never cared about money or fame or success. Like, no, that wouldn't make him human, you know.
And I can't imagine how frustrating and annoying it would be to go through your whole life constantly being badgered by journalists and authors and historians.
Yeah, and they would ask him things all the time. Well, what do you think your father would say about this? What do you think your father would say about this? And then you can imagine. So by 1909, which is the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, Robert would receive. Oh, I think I read this in one of his letters. I don't remember somewhere. He would receive 50 or 100 letters a day, and he answered all of them. I mean, his secretary answered most of them, but he responded to all of them because he felt like it was his duty as the heir of his father, the keeper of the legacy. But can you imagine that, just getting 50 letters a day that you felt compelled to answer, all about your father, some of which he could answer, some of which he couldn't, some of which he didn't want to. And most of his letters say, "Okay, well, yeah, here's the answer to your question, but listen, this is not for publication. This is not for a book. This is not for you to use. This is just for your information. And please keep it that way. Don't mention my name. Don't tell anybody I gave it to you." Because he didn't want to be, again, he didn't want to be part of that. He wanted to help, but not be on the
Mhm.
pedestal himself.
Yeah. Well, that's noble. But I mean, speaking of legacy, something that's pretty unfortunate that I learned is there's actually no Lincoln descendants alive today. Um, can you speak to that? Because it's actually kind of sad to me because I think one of our responsibilities as humans is to carry on our ancestors' legacy and carry on our family name and reproduce. I think that's ultimately why we're here is to reproduce. So it kind of does sadden me that there's no Lincoln descendants alive today.
Yeah, it's a sad story. So after three of Abraham Lincoln's four children died. So Robert got married and he had three children. He had two girls and a boy. And his son was Abraham Lincoln II. They called him Jack. And he was, by all accounts, kind of a reincarnation of Abraham Lincoln. He was brilliant. He was empathetic. He was, everything that Abraham Lincoln was, and which was how Robert was kind of raising him to be. Robert was raising him to be an attorney, go to Harvard like Robert did. They'd have a law practice together, father and son, and maybe politics. Who knows? Robert didn't want politics, but his son might. But when Robert was minister to Great Britain, Jack was 17 years old, and he had a carbuncle under his arm, basically a cyst. And the doctors kept cutting it open to drain the blood, which, back then, drain the blood out, that makes everything all better, right? So basically, they kept cutting him open, and ultimately, he got blood poisoning and he died when he was 17 years old. And so Robert was devastated, of course. And that was when he turned from law to business because he said, I was in the law for my son, and he's not here anymore. So then Robert had two daughters left. His oldest daughter had one son. His name was Abraham Lincoln Isham, and he went by Link. And then his younger daughter, Jessie, she had two children, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith and Mary Lincoln Beckwith. They called her Peggy. And Robert Lincoln Beckwith, they called him Bud. They loved nicknames in the Lincoln family. And all three of the Lincoln grandchildren did not have children. As far as we can tell, all of it was purposefully that they did not have children. Um, we know that if you read their letters and things, all three of them hated being Lincolns. They felt like sideshow freaks, like, oh, there's Abraham Lincoln's great great grandchild. And they just hated it. And so, Peggy, it's pretty obvious that she was a lesbian, so she never was married. Bud had a vasectomy when he was in his early 30s. And then Lincoln Isham just never had children. He had a stepchild, and maybe that was enough for him. I don't know. But yeah, so the last Lincoln descendant was Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, and he died in 1985.
It's sort of, oh man, it's so unfortunate. Tragic ending to the story.
It is, yeah. And but it's sad too. Like if you learn about them, particularly Bud and Peggy, we don't know as much about Link Isham because he was very quiet. But um, Bud and Peggy they could not have cared less that they were related to Abraham Lincoln. They gave away Lincoln family stuff. They sold it. They destroyed it. They really couldn't have cared less. Lincoln Isham, he did care. He donated a lot of things to the Library of Congress, as did his mother before him. So it's sad how much more we could still know, but they didn't care. So we don't. I'm sure we'll never even know the kind of things they probably gave away, sold, or destroyed about their ancestors.
That is so tragic. I mean, speaking of the lost history, I guess a lot of it's the result of just carelessness, which is unfortunate. But I have sort of a silly question for you. I was thinking about this last night, and I was, lying there and I thought, I can imagine studying, someone being a biographical historian, studying someone for, 30 years. Do you ever think about how you spent so much time researching the lives of these people that you've never met that are dead? Do you ever get sort of like a weird feeling to know like almost everything about someone?
I do. It's funny. I think about that sometimes as well. Yeah, it is interesting, and it's one of the big things as a biographer that I learned, and then even some reviewers commented on it in when my biography of Robert came out was, you know, you're trying, at least if you're a good historian, you're trying to be objective and present someone's life and legacy. How do you not fall in love with that person? And thereby, how do you not manipulate things to make them just look a little bit better when you can? Um, and that's a very interesting question. Yeah, sometimes I love to just talk about the Lincolns and stuff like that. And then sometimes I'm like, I really hope I don't sound like I'm lecturing to people just because they don't know and I do, but I just think it's fun. But it's interesting. I mean, so I've written 5 books about Mary Lincoln, and I've had a lot of people ask me to do a full biography of her. I'm like, I've done enough. I'm really, I'm not interested. I want to do something else. I'm actually also working on a Civil War book right now. And but then I was approached a few months ago to do this collected letters of Mary Lincoln, and I decided that I would. Um, and even now, I'm still, as I'm going through all these letters, I'm still learning more about her that I didn't know. Some of it is because I'm finding new letters. Some of it is because, you don't read everything someone's written unless you're doing a biography or a collection as I'm doing. So it is kind of weird to know everything. I often think about what would Abraham Lincoln say today to know that there's been what over 15,000 books written about him and more articles and all the movies and like wow, what would he, I'm sure, because he was a humble guy. He was arrogant in certain ways, but he was also humble. And I think he would think we're all ridiculous too to write so many books about his life.
That's something that I've sort of noticed in myself. I think a lot of historians and bookworms in general will have this in common, but it really hit me recently. I read Walter Isaacson's biography of Leonardo da Vinci. So I did it on audiobook, but it was like I got through it over the course of about a month. So to me, when I finished it, I had this deep vacuum in me. It was like this void, the post book blues that a lot of people talk about. But in my mind, I'm thinking like he was such a fascinating character, and I had just spent the last month of my life hanging out with this guy, getting to know this guy, becoming his friend. Like these people, they feel like they're your friend. You know what I mean? And the book concluded, and then it felt like I had to say goodbye. It was like this sad feeling.
Yep. I know exactly what you're talking about.
But you say that there's over 15,000 books about Lincoln. If you could recommend me the best Lincoln biography, one Lincoln biography, what would be the one to read?
Oh, that's a tough one. To be honest, I haven't read them all. I've read a lot of Lincoln books. I haven't read them all.
I I would assume so.
um, Also, I will admit, I've read so many Lincoln books that when a straight up biography comes out, I really don't read them unless I have to because I already know. So for me, I think, in my opinion, the best one volume is is called Lincoln by David Herbert Donald. That came out in the 1990s. That was an amazing book. Oh, you know what? Actually, I'm going to look right over here, all my Lincoln books. You can see some of them. You know what? I take that back. There was a new one that just came out that I just read last year. And okay, I'm going to blank on the name of it now. So while I'm quickly perusing the shelves here, if you're looking for a multi-volume book, Michael Burlingame did a two-volume life of Abraham Lincoln that came out 5 years or so ago, and it was incredible. It is just exhaustively detailed, but that might be a little big for some people who may just
I
want.
have John Meacham's biography. I haven't
That's
read
the
it
one.
though.
There it is. Yep, John Meacham. I was so impressed by that book. I would recommend that. So to be honest, I'm on a book award committee, and that was one of the books I had to read, and I didn't want to read it because I've read so many biographies of Lincoln, but I had to, and I was all in. It was incredible because he doesn't just list facts and describe what's happening. He analyzes and interprets everything, but he weaves it in such a wonderful narrative way that it really was an outstanding book. So I definitely recommend that. Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that because I have that one, and then I have American Lion, which is his Andrew Jackson biography.
Okay,
So
yeah, I have that. I haven't read it, I have to admit, but it's on the
it's
shelf.
good to hear that gets me sort of excited to read it. Another silly question for you, but also very serious. If you could have dinner with any three people from history except the Lincolns, you can't pick the Lincolns. Who would you hang out with?
Oh, wow, that's a tough one. Oh boy. Well, I'm wow. So just off the top of my head, because I love presidential history, so that's really my immediate thought goes to presidents, without sitting and thinking deeper about it. Um, I would love. to sit down and talk to Ronald Reagan. I'm utterly fascinated by Reagan for many levels, many reasons. But also, I just think he just seems like a good person too. Um, yeah, I would love to. I would love to talk. I know this may sound silly, but I'm also fascinated by Grover Cleveland,
Really?
President
I
Cleveland.
really don't know anything
Yeah,
about him
he
except
was
he served 2 non-consecutive terms.
he from what I've read a number of books about him. He just seems like he was a truly great man. He had integrity and honesty. He did what was right, and he could be partisan as all politicians are. He was a Democrat. He was the only Democrat elected to the presidency, pretty much between Lincoln and McKinley. Um, but he just a fascinating guy, just another a good man who did a lot of interesting things. When he first ran for president, it turns out that he had a child born out of wedlock before he was married, and all of his advisors found out about it. They telegraphed him, "Oh my God, what do we do? What do we do?" And he immediately wrote back and he said, "Whatever you do, tell the truth." I read about that during the Clinton years, so that really resonated with me. With yeah, tell the truth, because when you lie, how much worse do you make it? Um, yeah. So, oh boy, I don't know. I'm looking around here through my library, and I hate to seem cliche and think about and just name interesting presidents. I'm sure I could have a better list. Actually, you know what? I take that back. One person I love literature and poetry. I love the works of Dylan Thomas, the poet, and
I actually
I
am
would.
not familiar with him.
Oh, he is.
What era?
He was in the. He died in the 19, I think late 50s, I believe, and I think he was born in maybe early turn of the century. He's from Wales, and he is the most unique poet you'll ever read. His use of language is incredible, and his fiction is similarly incredible. But he also was just a big, pompous, loud guy. He loved to drink. He loved to be the center of attention, and I think he would be fun as hell to talk to. So yeah, I would definitely go with him.
Yeah, I sort of take the same strand. I have 2 serious picks and then a fun one. I'm Catholic, so I think Jesus would be extremely interesting to talk to. There's so many questions about, religion and are you actually the son of God and that sort of thing. And then my second pick, these are both my locks that I undisputable. My second one is actually Leonardo da Vinci. I think he is the most fascinating human being to ever inhabit planet Earth. And then my third, it's kind of heresy because I don't have any American history picks. Well, actually, yes, I do. This guy's an American. This is American history, but not like how we think of it. Founding fathers would be cool. Um, but my third pick is a fun one. I'm a huge Elvis fan, so I would want to hang out with Elvis.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's a good one. Yeah, there's just so many. Like I didn't even think beyond America when you asked me that, but there's just so many. I agree with you though. Da Vinci is just mind blowing. His brilliance is unbelievable.
I know. I mean, this guy, he had these to-do lists that were like like it's like a human brain like thought this way, just the way he thought about the world and his level of curiosity. Like, have you if you've ever read Walter Isaacson's book, he opens it on a kind of curiosity loop and he closes it in the conclusion. But he was looking at one of because he would make a to-do list every day, and the things that were on his to-do list were so unorthodox. And on one of his to-do lists he had describe the tongue of a woodpecker.
Really?
I mean, who thinks like that?
Right. That's amazing.
Who looks at the world and sees, I wonder what the tongue of a woodpecker is like. But it's actually really fascinating. He answers it in the conclusion, and the tongue of a woodpecker, when they're pecking the tree, they're actually the amount of force that's generated is 10 times the amount of force that would kill a human. So their tongue like wraps in their head, wraps around their brain and protects their brain from the force, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, yeah. But one last question for you. What advice do you have for young people? young people who are looking to find themselves in today's world?
In general, or to be a historian, or just
In
anything?
general.
Boy, oh, well, that's a tough one. I would say have endless curiosity, just especially in this era of cell phones. And I'm no better than anybody else. I look at my phone way too often. I play games when I should be reading. But have endless curiosity and get out of your comfort zone. But really, I think it's all about discover, and this is cliche, but discover what you love, discover your passion, and follow that. I mean, I was a journalist for 30 years or so, while also being a historian. The journalism paid the bills, not well, but it paid them. Um, but there's so many things you can do if you want to make money, but you may be miserable doing it. Um, there's so many things in life that you can do and be miserable, but you might think that, well, this is the way it's supposed to be because society says so. I think life is short. You know, be happy with who you are and what you do, and never stop thinking. I feel like when I was younger, I feel like I used to be smarter and more intellectually curious than I am now. For whatever reason, one is probably just life responsibilities get in the way, but it makes me sad sometimes. So I try to get back to that curiosity of, you know, one day you read some philosophy, one day you read physics for dummies, one day you read about Da Vinci, one day you read about, yeah, you read the newspaper, and um, I don't think enough people do that anymore, and I think the world is a lesser place for it.
100%. That is absolutely beautiful advice. Very well said. That's generally what I tell people too. I think it all starts with just be curious about the world, find something that interests you and read about it. But if you're losing that thread of curiosity, I would recommend Walter Isaacson's Da Vinci Bio. It it kind of like changed my perspective on life in terms of being curious about everything. There's just a million reasons to look around every single day and just be shocked and mystified by the beautiful intricacies of the world. There's so much beauty and poetry in the mundane that we just walk by in our day-to-day lives and never even notice. And I think it would do a lot of people a lot of good to kind of take a step back sometimes and just stop and look around at the world around them and really appreciate.
Absolutely. Well, you've convinced me. I'm definitely going to read that book now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, taking 2 hours out of your day to chat with me. It was an absolute pleasure. I mean, this was a fascinating conversation. I knew nothing about Mary or Robert Lincoln or kind of his personal family life until I came across your work, and it truly is incredible. But what are you working on, and where can people find your work?
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. This has been a great conversation. Absolutely. Yeah, right now as I said, I was working on a Civil War book. I took a little detour to do this collected letters of Mary Lincoln. So now I'm kind of doing both at the same time. Those won't be out for probably a couple of years yet. I have an author page on Amazon.com. I have a website, JasonEmersonHistorian.com. And yeah, all my books. I have 8 books that I've written. You can find all those on Amazon or any online bookseller. And yeah, if you Google me, I've got articles out there. I've got lots of. You can find lots of me on YouTube giving various talks to various things. Or, um, you know, I've been on TV a couple times, which is horrible, but but I guess it was something. It was fun at the time. But
Well, I'll have all that linked down in the description so people can go check that out. But Jason, thank you.
wonderful. Thank you so much.